0640. Picture this. You are standing in the blue dark before sunrise, your boots crusted with old ice, your breath freezing into your eyebrows. Pressed flat against your chest under 3 layers of wool and canvas is an oilcloth bundle, no bigger than a folded newspaper. Your heart is beating against it. You can feel the cloth shift with every breath you take. 20 minutes from now, a convoy of black vehicles bearing the white sunburst of the Concordat Inspectorate will roll up the switchback road and park in the courtyard of your mountain outpost. If they find what is sewn into the lining of your coat, your unit does not simply lose its colors. Your unit ceases to have ever existed. The names of your dead friends will be struck from the rolls. The villages that sent their sons to fight under your banner will be told those sons fought for nothing, under no flag, in no recognized war. You are not afraid of being shot. You are afraid of being erased. We always picture defeated soldiers as broken men trudging home with their heads down. But the reality is standing right here in the freezing dark of Carmel Ridge, with a folded piece of dyed cloth pressed against a heartbeat. What does a soldier actually carry home when his country has lost the war, and the victors have come to take his name? Welcome to the quiet, forgotten story of the brigade that was asked to surrender its flags and did not hand them over. Before we walk into that freezing courtyard together, if you find yourself drawn to the small, forgotten corners of history, the moments that never make the textbooks but somehow survive anyway, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And drop a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight. There is something quietly beautiful about strangers from different corners of the world gathering around a story like this, all of us leaning in to hear what the official record left out. To understand the weight of that small folded bundle, you have to understand what it cost to keep it. The Carmel Ridge Brigade had been stationed on that pass for 11 years. 11 winters. 11 summers that never really felt like summer, because at 4,000 meters the wind never warms and the sun is something that looks at you rather than touches you. The brigade was a peacekeeping formation, slotted into the high pass after the first ceasefire, the one that did not hold. When the fighting started again, they were the only unit left in the corridor. The capital, 600 kilometers south in a city of glass and warm restaurants, did not send reinforcements. They sent communiques. They sent revised maps. They sent, on one memorable occasion, a crate of ceremonial dress uniforms 2 sizes too small for the men who were actually still alive to wear them. What the brigade did not receive was relief, so they stayed. They fought a slow, grinding war against irregular forces who knew the mountain better than they did. They patrolled passes where the air was so thin that a man running uphill could feel his vision narrow into a tunnel. They buried their dead in shallow graves of stacked rock because the ground was frozen too hard to dig, and because nobody who had been on the ridge for more than a year had the strength left to swing a pick for very long. By the time the second ceasefire was announced, the brigade that had marched up the road 11 years earlier with 2,400 soldiers in its ranks could put 612 men and women on parade. The rest were under the rocks, or in shallow medical graves down at the supply depot, or had been sent home so broken in lung and joint that they would never wear a uniform again. The capital had stopped mentioning the brigade in official broadcasts 3 years before the ceasefire. Their war was an embarrassment. Their survival was an inconvenience. When the politicians sat down at the negotiating table to draw the new lines on the map, nobody in the room remembered to ask what was happening on Carmel Ridge. This is where the second wound opens, and it is a deeper one than the cold. The brigade was not made up of a single nation's soldiers. It was a coalition formation, stitched together 15 years earlier out of small countries and smaller provinces that had pooled their few volunteers into one unit so that they could afford to send anyone at all. You had farmers from the lowland river towns. You had mountaineers from the eastern foothills who could climb in their sleep. You had 2 companies of women from the coastal districts, recruited during the desperate years when the bigger powers refused to commit troops. Each of those communities had sent their soldiers up the pass under a banner of their own. Town colors, regional standards, old regimental flags inherited from grandfathers who had fought in older, half-forgotten wars. The brigade carried 11 flags in total. 11 small pieces of dyed cloth representing 11 small places that had sent their children to die at 4,000 meters for a cause the capital had since decided was no longer convenient. When the diplomats sat down to negotiate the ceasefire, those 11 flags did not appear in the treaty. The treaty mentioned the two major belligerent powers. It mentioned the Concordat as guarantor. It mentioned the disposition of certain border territories. It did not mention the brigade by name, because the brigade was not a national army. It was a footnote, a logistical loose end. In an annex on page 47, under the heading Non-State Combatant Formations, the treaty noted that any such formations operating in the contested zone were to be peacefully dissolved within 60 days of the signing, with their colors and standards to be presented to the Concordat Inspectorate for archival preservation. That was it. 11 flags, 11 communities, 11 years of dead in the rocks, all summarized in a single bureaucratic sentence buried in the back of a document. None of the soldiers on the ridge would ever be shown. Then came the cream-colored paper. 3 weeks after the ceasefire was announced over the brigade's failing radio set, a Concordat helicopter dropped a sealed envelope at the outpost. Inside was a document so clean and well printed that it looked like it had come from a different planet than the one the brigade had been living on. The terms were generous on the surface. Every surviving member of the Carmel Ridge Formation would be granted honorable discharge under Concordat oversight. Safe passage off the mountain would be guaranteed by an inspectorate escort. A small monetary stipend, payable in stable Concordat scrip, would be issued to each soldier upon their return to their home district. Medical evaluation and basic rehabilitation services would be made available at any of 3 regional centers. All the brigade had to do, in exchange for these terms, was participate in a formal lowering ceremony. The ceremony was described in careful, almost loving detail. The brigade would muster in full dress order in the courtyard of the outpost. The senior surviving officer would present arms. The 11 unit standards would be lowered from their poles, folded according to the protocol attached as Appendix B, and presented one by one to the senior inspectorate officer present. The flags would then be transported to a Concordat archival facility, where they would be catalogued, preserved, and entered into the official record of the conflict. For the first time in 11 years, somebody in a warm office somewhere was using words like dignified and honorable and preserved in relation to the brigade. For a few hours after the envelope arrived, you could see something almost like hope on the faces of the soldiers in the mess tent. They had been forgotten for so long that the simple act of being mentioned by name in an official document felt like the beginning of being remembered. That hope lasted until Major Idris Halberg finished reading the fine print. Halberg was the senior surviving officer of the brigade, a stocky man in his late 40s with eyes that had not properly closed for sleep in several years. He had been a junior lieutenant when the brigade marched up the pass. He had inherited command through the slow attrition of every officer above him, not through promotion boards but through funerals. He took the cream-colored document into his quarters, lit the small kerosene lamp on his field desk, and read every page, including the appendices, including the footnotes, including the section in smaller type at the back that the inspectorate did not particularly want anyone to read. What he found in that smaller type, on a page headed Standard Disposition Protocols for Non-State Combatant Materials, was the truth behind the ceremony. The flags were not going to be archived. The word archival in the front of the document was a courtesy. In the back of the document, in the actual operating procedures, the language was different. Non-state combatant standards were to be catalogued, photographed for the historical record, and then transported to a sealed processing facility 300 kilometers south, where they would be incinerated in accordance with Concordat heritage management policy. The reason was given in a single dry sentence. The continued existence of physical standards belonging to dissolved non-state formations created administrative complications regarding successor claims, pension disputes, and unauthorized commemorative activity. Halberg read that sentence 3 times. He understood what he was reading. If the flags continued to exist, the brigade continued to exist. If the brigade continued to exist, the 11 communities that had sent their children up the pass had a legal basis to claim recognition, to demand pensions for the widows, to insist that their dead be named on monuments, to teach their children that the war had happened and that their grandfathers had fought in it under a flag of their own. If the flags were quietly burned in a sealed facility 300 kilometers away, all of that vanished. No flag, no unit. No unit, no veterans. No veterans, no story. The ceremony was not a dignified close. The ceremony was an erasure dressed in clean language and a printed appendix. Idris Halberg sat in his quarters for a long time after he finished reading. He did not call his officers in immediately. He let the lamp burn down to its last finger of kerosene. He thought about the rocks behind the outpost where his friends were buried. He thought about a particular village 3 valleys east of his hometown, a place called Sens, which had sent 38 young men and women up the pass over the 11 years of the war, and which had received back exactly 9. He thought about the small green flag with the white mountain on it that flew over the outpost gate, the flag of Sens, the flag those 38 had marched under. He thought about that flag being catalogued, photographed, and incinerated in a sealed facility in a country none of them had ever visited. When he finally rose from his desk, he moved slowly, the way a man moves when he has decided something he cannot afford to second-guess. He sent his runner to bring his officers in, one at a time, quietly, by the back path that ran behind the supply huts. He did not want the conversation that was about to happen to be visible from the courtyard. There were 7 of them in the stone hut at the back of the camp. Halberg, 3 captains, 2 lieutenants and the brigade's senior sergeant, a woman named Anya Voss who had been on the ridge since the first year, and who held the institutional memory of the formation, the way other people hold their wedding photographs. The hut was cold. The single lamp on the table cast their shadows long and uneven across the walls. Halberg laid the cream-colored document on the table and read out the paragraph from the appendix in a flat, quiet voice. When he was done, none of them spoke for a long time. Sergeant Voss was the first to move. She put both hands flat on the table, looked down at them, and then looked up at Halberg. She did not ask what the major was planning. She asked what the major needed her to do. That was how the decision was made, not with a speech, not with a vote, not with a clenched fist on a table. It was made when a sergeant who had buried more friends than she could count looked at her commanding officer and offered him her hands. The 2 lieutenants followed her lead within a few seconds. One of the captains argued briefly, quietly, that compliance was the only realistic option, that the alternative was being shot off the mountain by an inspectorate escort battalion, that no flag was worth the lives of 600 soldiers who had finally been given a way home. Halberg listened to him without interrupting. When the captain was finished, Halberg said only one thing. He said, "We are not going to refuse the ceremony. We are going to attend the ceremony. We are simply not going to give them the flags." The captain understood what was being proposed about 3 seconds after the sentence ended. He sat down slowly. He did not argue again. By the time the lamp guttered out and they filed back to their quarters by the back path, all 7 of them knew exactly what was going to happen over the next 4 nights, and exactly what the rest of their lives would look like if they were caught. The work began the following night and continued for 4 nights running, in the lamplight of the supply hut behind the mess tent. Sergeant Voss organized it with the same calm precision she had once used to organize medical evacuations under fire. The 11 brigade standards were brought in one at a time, off their poles, after the daily lowering. Each was inspected, the small tears and stains catalogued so that the replicas could be made to match. Then each was carefully unstitched from its pole sleeve, laid flat on the wooden table, and folded in the old field fold, The tight rectangular fold soldiers have used for 2 centuries to compress a flag into the smallest possible packet. A folded flag in the field fold is roughly the size of a thick book. 11 folded flags, distributed among 7 officers' winter coats, was a manageable burden. The linings of the coats were opened along the inside seam with a small curved knife. The folded flags, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from sweat and weather, were slid into the cavity between the outer canvas and the wool lining. The seams were closed again with waxed thread, the stitches tiny and even, the work done by Sergeant Voss, and a corporal from the coastal companies who had been a tailor's apprentice before the war. While the real flags were being hidden, 2 other soldiers worked at the next table on the replicas. They had spare canvas from old shelter halves. They had dye from the medical stores, iodine and methylene blue, and a handful of other things that, mixed carefully, produced colors close enough to the originals that the inspectorate would not look twice. The replicas did not need to survive close examination. They only needed to be folded according to Appendix B, presented with full ceremony and signed for. After that, they could be incinerated. The Concordat would be incinerating their own forgery and never know it. There is a particular quiet that descends on a room where 7 exhausted soldiers and a handful of trusted helpers are stitching their identity into the linings of their coats by lamplight, knowing that one informer, one careless word, one mistake with a thread would end them. It is not the quiet of fear. It is the quiet of something else, something closer to prayer. None of them prayed out loud. They were not that kind of unit. But the work was done with the same care a prayer is offered with, and when it was finished on the 4th night, and the last seam was closed on the last coat, Sergeant Voss laid her hands flat on the table again, just as she had in the stone hut, and let out a long breath she seemed to have been holding for a week. The lowering ceremony took place on a morning so cold that the breath of 600 soldiers in formation rose above the courtyard like a single low cloud. The Concordat convoy arrived exactly on time. Inspector Rule Tam stepped out of the lead vehicle in a long gray overcoat and polished boots that had never seen mountain mud. He was a thin, courteous man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead and a leather folio under his arm. He was not cruel. He was not even unkind. He was simply doing his job, which was the disposal of administrative loose ends, and he did it the way a competent civil servant does any task, with attention to procedure and a mild regret that the day was so cold. He shook Major Halberg's hand at the gate. He asked after the health of the soldiers. He apologized for the brevity of the ceremony, nodding that his convoy needed to be off the ridge before the afternoon weather closed the road. Halberg replied with the same careful courtesy. The 2 men walked together to the small reviewing platform at the courtyard's edge. Inspector Tam opened his folio and began to read the formal Concordat language, the same language that had been read at 37 other lowering ceremonies across the contested zone in the previous 2 months. He read about honor. He read about closure. He read about the historical importance of preserving the standards of all formations, regardless of their political status, for the education of future generations. The 600 soldiers in formation listened without moving. Their coats were heavy that morning, heavier than they should have been, but the cold was a good cover for any unusual stiffness in the way the officers stood. Sergeant Voss was in the front rank of her company. She kept her eyes forward. She did not look at Major Halberg. She did not look at the 11 poles standing in a neat row at the courtyard's center, each flying its replica flag, each replica fluttering exactly as the original would have fluttered, dyed and stained and frayed at the edges to match. Inspector Tam finished his reading. He nodded to his aide. The aide nodded to the Concordat color party, 4 soldiers in clean dress uniform who had probably never been within 1,000 kilometers of actual fighting. The color party advanced to the first pole. The replica was lowered slowly, hand over hand, by one of Halberg's lieutenants. When it reached the lieutenant's hands, he folded it according to Appendix B, the slow ceremonial fold, 12 precise movements, each one observed by Inspector Tam with the patient attention of a man making sure the paperwork was being done correctly. The folded replica was presented to the senior member of the color party. The Concordat soldier received it, bowed slightly, and carried it to a long wooden box that had been placed at the foot of the reviewing platform. The replica was laid inside. The lid was not yet closed. They were going to fill the box first. The process was repeated 10 more times. 11 poles, 11 slow folds, 11 replicas laid carefully into the wooden box. Inspector Tam watched all of it. He signed his receipt at the end. He shook Major Halberg's hand a second time. He told the major that the Concordat appreciated the dignity and professionalism with which the brigade had conducted itself, and that the historical record would reflect this. Halberg replied that the brigade was grateful for the inspector's courtesy. The box was loaded into the second vehicle of the convoy. The convoy began its descent down the switchback road. Within an hour, the only sign that the Concordat had ever been on the ridge was the faint diesel smell hanging in the cold air of the courtyard, and the 11 empty poles standing in their neat row. The replicas would be in the sealed processing facility within 3 days. They would be photographed for the archive. They would be catalogued by serial number. They would be incinerated in a controlled furnace on the morning of the following Tuesday, in accordance with Concordat heritage management policy. Inspector Ruel Tam would file his report. He would receive a small commendation for the efficient completion of the Carmichael disposition. He would retire 11 years later with a clean record and a modest pension, and he would die at the age of 78, without ever once suspecting that the box he had so carefully signed for had contained 11 pieces of stained shelter canvas dyed with iodine. This kind of thing has happened, by the way, in more wars than the textbooks will ever acknowledge. Authority almost never catches the quiet refusal, because authority has been trained to search the obvious places. Authority searches barracks for hidden weapons. Authority searches letters for hidden codes. Authority almost never searches the lining of a defeated soldier's coat for the folded identity of a community it has just decided no longer exists. Across centuries and continents, in dozens of dissolved units and silenced provinces and forbidden languages, the same quiet act has repeated itself in different forms. Something small, something foldable, something that fits inside the seam of a coat or the spine of a book or the hem of a wedding dress. Authority almost always assumes that what cannot be seen is not there. It is one of authority's oldest and most consistent mistakes. Sergeant Anya Voss came down off the ridge a week after the ceremony, with the rest of the brigade, in a convoy of Concordat trucks that delivered them in batches to their home districts. The stipend was paid as promised. The medical evaluation was offered at the regional center, and most of the soldiers attended at least once. The honorable discharge papers were issued on cream-colored paper, not unlike the original document. Within a year, the Carmichael Brigade had ceased to exist in any official sense, exactly as the treaty had specified. Voss returned to her hometown on the coast, a small port called Halmer, and she did what defeated soldiers have done in every century. She found work. She married a man who had not been to the war. She had a daughter and then a granddaughter. She did not talk about the ridge. When her daughter asked, on one occasion in childhood, what the war had been like, Voss said only that it had been cold and that she had been lucky, and she did not say anything else. The coat hung in the back of her closet for 61 years. She did not unstitch the lining. She did not look at the folded flag. She had not been the one to carry the flag of Halmer off the mountain, but the coat in her closet did contain one of the 11, the small blue and white standard of a fishing village 3 valleys east of her own, a village whose surviving veterans she had never met. She kept the coat because Halberg had asked her to. She kept it because the act of keeping it was the last order she had been given by an officer she had loved, and she was the kind of soldier who did not stop obeying such orders simply because the war was over. Major Idris Halberg himself died of a stroke 4 years after coming down off the ridge. His coat passed to his son, who never knew what was in the lining, and from his son to a grandson, and the flag inside it eventually surfaced in a regional museum in the late part of the century, when the grandson, Cleaning out an attic, noticed unusual stitching along the inside seam and called a textile conservator. The conservator was the one who opened the seam. The conservator was the one who wept. Anya Voss died at the age of 83 in her own bed, on a spring morning when the wind off the harbor smelled of salt and new fish. Her granddaughter, a young woman named Myra who worked at the Regional Historical Society, was the one who packed up the closet. Myra found the coat in the back, on a wooden hanger, the wool gone slightly stiff with age but the canvas outer shell still sound. She almost donated it without inspection. The local museum was running a collection drive for everyday objects from the war generation, and an old peacekeeper's winter coat was exactly the kind of thing they were looking for. Something stopped her. It might have been the weight. The coat was heavier than a coat of that size and material should have been. It might have been a thing her grandmother had said once, many years earlier, when Myra as a child had asked why the old woman kept that ugly old coat in the closet when she never wore it. Her grandmother had said, "That coat is not mine to throw away." Myra had not understood the sentence at the time. She had filed it away the way children file away the strange remarks of grandparents. Standing in the closet 61 years after the lowering ceremony, holding the coat in her hands, she remembered the sentence, and she understood it the way Sergeant Voss had once understood the order Major Halberg gave by lamplight. Myra took the coat to the museum. She did not unstitch the lining herself. She gave it to the senior textile conservator, a careful man in his 60s named Petter, and she told him what her grandmother had once said about it. Petter laid the coat flat on a long table under bright cool light. He found the seam. He found the wax thread, still holding after 61 years, the stitches still tiny and even, the work still recognizably the work of a sergeant and a corporal who had been a tailor's apprentice before the war. He opened the seam with a curved blade so small it could have been used for surgery. He drew out the oilcloth bundle. He unfolded the oilcloth. He unfolded the field fold of the flag inside slowly, the way you unfold a letter from someone you loved who is no longer alive. The flag was the small blue and white standard of a fishing village 3 valleys east of Halmer, a village that had sent 41 young men and women up the pass and received back 11. The colors were faded, but the cloth was whole. The white mountain on the blue field was still recognizable. The hand-stitched edge, where some grandmother in the village had hemmed the flag herself before her grandsons marched off with it, was still intact. Petter the conservator was the one who wept, but Myra, who had not known her grandmother, had been a sergeant, who had not known her grandmother had been on Carmichael Ridge, who had not known that the heavy old coat in the back of the closet had been carrying for 61 years a piece of cloth that an entire bureaucracy had once tried to burn. Myra was the one who finally understood the moral of a story she had not known she was inside of. A nation can take your land. A nation can take your weapons. A nation can take your rank, your pay, your pension, your name on the monument, and the legal recognition of the war you fought. A nation, working with sufficient bureaucratic patience and a sealed processing facility 300 kilometers from anywhere, can erase the official record of an entire formation and the 11 communities that sent their children to die in it. But a nation cannot take what you choose to carry quietly. It cannot search every coat. It cannot open every seam. It cannot find what it does not think to look for, because the imagination of authority is always narrower than the imagination of the people authority is trying to erase. This is not only an old story, and it is not only a soldier's story. Every defeated culture has done some version of it. Every silenced language has survived in a grandmother's lullaby that the regime did not think to ban. Every forbidden faith has continued in a small object hidden in a wall, a prayer book in a false-bottomed drawer, a recipe passed down in a kitchen that the authorities had no reason to enter. The Concordat Inspectorate and its sealed furnaces are a particular form of a very old problem. The folded flag in the lining of a coat is a particular form of a very old answer. When you walk through a museum today, and you see a small piece of faded cloth in a glass case, and the placard next to it explains that this object survived because someone hid it in the hem of a dress, or the binding of a book, or the lining of a winter coat. You are looking at the same answer in a different language. You are looking at the moment when a person decided that what authority had declared no longer existed was, in fact, still going to exist, because they personally were going to carry it. The flag on Petter's table that morning, faded blue and white under the cool museum light, was not the only one. The other 10 surfaced over the following decade, one at a time, as old coats came out of old closets and old children grew curious about unusual stitching along inside seams. All 11 of the Carmahel standards are now in regional museums in the communities that originally sent them up the pass. The veterans of the brigade, the surviving ones, lived long enough to see their dead finally named on monuments in their hometowns, because once the flags existed again, the brigade existed again, and once the brigade existed again, the dead could be counted. Inspector Rule Tam was 11 years in his grave by the time the first flag surfaced. He never knew. He died believing he had done his job correctly, and in a narrow administrative sense he had. The paperwork was perfect. The receipt was signed. The box was incinerated on the scheduled Tuesday. It is only that the box had contained shelter canvas and iodine, and the real story had walked off the mountain in the lining of 7 officers' coats. And authority, as authority almost always does, had searched only the obvious places. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this one. If a small folded piece of cloth in the lining of a coat moved you, even a little, please take a moment to like this video and to subscribe, because stories like this one survive the same way the flag survived, by being passed quietly from one person to the next, until enough people are carrying them that they cannot be erased. Tell me in the comments below what small thing your own family carried through a hard time, what recipe or song or object or word survived because someone in your line decided quietly that it was going to. I would like to read those. Until next time, keep carrying what matters and keep stitching it into the lining where authority does not think to look.